Hidden behind a mile-long red brick wall in Menlo Park, just off Middlefield Road, sits an iron gateway that seems to lead nowhere. It stands alone now, a relic of another age, framed by manicured lawns and modern homes that betray no hint of the grandeur buried beneath. Yet behind this gate, more than a century ago, began one of the most extravagant architectural ambitions in the American West. Today, there is no trace of the building it once guarded. No spires, no domes, no echoing marble halls, just silence. But if you listen closely, the story of Linden Towers begins to whisper through the ground. The land it once stood on was called the Carroll property, a vast oak-studded tract of 600 acres that rolled out like a green sea beneath the California sun. It was peaceful, idyllic, untouched, until one man's vision turned it into something almost mythic. This wasn't just a house. It was an illusion, a monument to fortune, ambition, and something far more elusive, the desire to be remembered. Long before the foundations were poured and limestone walls rose skyward, the land waited, quietly. And then came James Clair Flood. Flood had no noble blood, no inheritance, no title. What he had was a genius for timing, a ruthless mind for business, and a sense of spectacle. He was one of the so-called bonanza kings, men who turned the dirt of Nevada into rivers of silver and rewrote the definition of American wealth. But Flood wasn't content with numbers on paper or columns in ledgers. He wanted permanence, stone, glass, towers that pierced the sky, arches that cast shadows across manicured lawns. He wanted a house that would outlive him. And for a time, it did. The mansion he built, known as Linden Towers, quickly became a legend. Rising 6 stories above the gardens of Menlo Park, it was more palace than home, more fantasy than residence. Locals called it a white castle, with a tone that blended admiration and disbelief. Ornate to the point of absurdity, its design seemed borrowed from a dream, scrollwork dripping from every edge, cupolas reflecting the sun, porticos flanked by statues that gazed forever into the horizon. It looked like it belonged on the top of a wedding cake, not in the California countryside, and yet it stood, defiantly and proudly, for decades. It was a house that never truly belonged to the earth it was built upon. It was too theatrical, too immense, too contradictory. Even in its heyday, it seemed out of step with the world around it, a silent colossus that appeared from the future, or perhaps from a past that never quite happened. What made Linden Towers extraordinary wasn't just its size or cost, or even the man who paid for it. It was the sheer audacity of its existence. A structure so large and lavish, constructed not in New York or Paris or Vienna, but on quiet land nestled among trees in a part of California barely touched by the city. It wasn't meant to blend in. It was meant to astonish, to disrupt, to demand attention from anyone who stumbled across it. Now, decades later, all that remains above ground is a stretch of that red brick fence, and the gate that once creaked open to welcome the wealthy and the curious. But what lies beneath, layered under 10 feet of soil and paved sidewalks, are the bones of that dream. Marble fragments, carved stone, shattered chandeliers. The remains of Linden Towers weren't carted away. They were swallowed whole by the very earth they once towered above. And so, the story begins, not with what was built, but with what was lost, not with rooms and blueprints, but with memory and forgetting. To uncover the tale of California's most ambitious mansion, you don't need a key. You need to look past what's visible and follow the faint outline of a palace that should never have existed, yet did, for a moment, for a lifetime, for just long enough to become legend. James Clair Flood was never meant to build palaces. Born in 1826 on Staten Island to impoverished Irish immigrants, his early life was defined by limits, limited education, limited prospects, limited expectations. He didn't grow up hearing about castles or fortune. He grew up in a carriage workshop, hammering iron and sanding wood, dreaming perhaps of one day owning a small business of his own. There was no hint then that this quiet, observant apprentice would become one of the richest men in American history. But something in him refused to accept the world as it was handed to him. By the age of 23, Flood had spent nearly a decade working with carriages, and the future stretched out before him like the endless streets of his hometown, predictable, narrow, hard-earned. Then came the rumors. California. Gold. A land where fortunes weren't earned over decades but discovered in a single afternoon. For most, it was fantasy. For Flood, it was enough. He gathered what little he had and left everything behind. His first trip west didn't yield a miracle, just a modest collection of gold and silver nuggets. Enough to go home, propose to Mary Leary, his childhood sweetheart, and head back west with a new sense of hope. In San Francisco, the young couple settled into the rhythm of risk. When gold failed them, Flood and his new business partner, William S. O'Brien, opened a saloon. That saloon became a stock brokerage. And that brokerage, in one of the most fateful pivots in 19th century finance, turned towards silver. The two men moved operations to Nevada just as the Comstock lode, an underground treasure trove of silver, began to reveal itself. With two other partners, they invested in the Consolidated Virginia Mining Company. At first, the results were modest, but then came 1873. In a single extraordinary year, the mine revealed what would be called the Big Bonanza, the largest silver lode in recorded history, a vertical pillar of precious metal plunging 1,200 feet into the earth. At its peak valuation, the mine was worth over $1 billion in today's terms. Flood didn't just benefit from the silver, he manipulated its value with cunning precision. As new veins were discovered, he quietly bought stock, letting the public discover the news only after his position was secured. When the bubble burst, he had already cashed out. He wasn't just lucky, he was calculated, patient, and always 5 steps ahead. What do men like that do with money? Some vanish, some gamble it away. Flood built a legacy. He founded the Nevada Bank, acquired massive tracts of land, and watched his name ascend into the ranks of America's financial elite. But money, for all its power, never seemed to be the end point. It was a means to something grander. And that's where the mansion comes in. Flood didn't build Linden Towers because he needed a home. He built it because he needed a monument, something to declare, without words, the sheer scale of what he had accomplished. This wasn't about comfort. It wasn't even about style. It was about proof that a poor Irish boy with no inheritance could carve a fortune from rock and reshape the California skyline, that someone who had started with nothing could now afford to build something the world had never seen before. In a way, the mansion was his autobiography written in stone, a story of escape, ascension, and the quiet hunger for permanence. No longer just a name in a ledger, Flood had become a force. And Linden Towers, impossible, theatrical, magnificent, was the echo of that force made real. Menlo Park in the late 1800s was not yet the heart of innovation or technology. It was a quiet expanse of pastoral beauty, where oak trees stood like sentinels over open fields, and the scent of grass and wildflowers lingered in the air. The land that would eventually cradle Linden Towers was known as the Carroll property, a 600-acre estate of flat, fertile terrain, untouched by urban noise. There were no towering buildings, no clang of machinery, just sun-drenched meadows and groves of native shrubs. It was a place that invited stillness, a space that whispered restraint. And perhaps that's exactly why James Flood chose it. For a man whose entire life had defied limits, this untouched land was a blank canvas. He didn't want to build in the hills, where the elite had already claimed their ground. He wanted distance, scale, dominion. Menlo Park offered something that San Francisco or Nob Hill could not: room for illusion. Here, he could create not just a house, but a self-contained world. A stage for his wealth, a sanctuary for his legacy, and a backdrop vast enough to hold his imagination. The decision wasn't without strategy. The Southern Pacific Railroad passed close by, providing access for guests arriving from San Francisco. The peninsula's climate was milder than the city's fog-choked summers, and the flat terrain allowed for sweeping sightlines and perfectly manicured gardens. But above all, the land was still untouched by ego. It hadn't yet been shaped by the ambitions of others. That made it ideal for a man whose vision could not be compromised. Flood didn't just build a mansion, he implanted a spectacle. As the plans for Linden Towers took shape, the locals watched in confusion and awe. What rose from the earth wasn't a home in any traditional sense. It was a 6-story fusion of styles that evoked European palaces, fairy tale castles, and operatic stage sets all at once. The white limestone facade caught the sun like polished marble. Towers and gables competed for attention, while domes and cupolas broke the sky in every direction. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't meant to be. Neighbors nicknamed it the wedding cake, a building so ornate, so indulgently frosted with detail that it felt more like a fantasy than architecture. Porticos framed with carved stonework, balustrades curling like frozen ribbon, and relief sculptures covering nearly every visible surface. It was a house where nothing was left untouched, where every corner, every cornice, every angle was exaggerated to the edge of absurdity. Yet within that excess, there was precision. The estate was arranged not just for beauty, but for impact. Visitors arriving by carriage would travel a long gravel path, winding past gardens, fountains, and statuary, each turn revealing a new slice of the mansion, carefully composed like a stage curtain, lifting to reveal the next act. The approach was slow by design, heightening anticipation, amplifying the drama. Linden Towers did not conform to the land. It overruled it. It pushed aside the quiet dignity of the Carroll property and replaced it with a declaration. This was not a retreat from the world. It was an announcement. An empire had been built from Nevada's silver, and this house, this gleaming, surreal monument, was its crown. From the moment Linden Towers began to rise above the horizon, it sent a message, loud, unapologetic, and impossible to ignore. This was not simply a large home. It was an architectural marvel designed to overwhelm. Standing 6 stories tall, clad in pale limestone that shimmered under the California sun, the structure looked more like a European royal residence than a private estate tucked away in Menlo Park. Its Italianate style was only a foundation. Onto it, layers of eclectic grandeur were added, cupolas with oxidized copper crowns, ornamental gables, turrets flanked by carved reliefs, and statues perched high above, staring down at visitors like silent sentinels. The closer one approached, the more the details began to emerge, each one more intricate, more exaggerated than the last. Towering columns framed the arched windows, while delicate floral scrollwork crept along the eaves and balcony rails. Every facade of the mansion seemed to tell a different story, a different mood. One side whispered Venetian elegance with loggias and wrought iron balconies. Another burst into Gothic drama with pointed arches and sculpted gargoyles. The roofline danced with domes and spires, constantly shifting the silhouette against the sky, as if the house itself was trying on different identities. Visitors arriving by carriage didn't just arrive, they experienced an unveiling. First came the distant glimpse beyond the gates, a silhouette against the trees. Then the winding drive, where the house played hide and seek behind garden walls, marble fountains, and rows of cypress. At each curve, a new architectural detail was revealed, teasing the viewer with hints of what was to come. By the time the full breadth of the house finally stood in view, framed by lush greenery and grazing cattle in the distant pastures, the effect was nothing short of theatrical. The sheer scale of the mansion overwhelmed the senses. The windows alone were oversized and numerous, drawing in natural light that would later spill across gold-leafed interiors. The front portico towered above the gravel approach, its entry framed by double-height columns, statuary, and carved friezes depicting mythological scenes. Every visual element was designed to disorient and impress, to erase the line between fantasy and reality. This wasn't just a house. It was a set piece for a dream that James Flood had turned into stone. What made Linden Towers so astonishing wasn't just its ornamentation, but its precision. Each sculpture, each cornice, each repeating motif had been placed with intention. The house had rhythm, a choreography of styles that somehow balanced grandeur with symmetry. The architects and craftsmen who worked on it were not merely constructing walls. They were creating an immersive experience, one where every glance, every perspective shift offered a new layer of visual storytelling. Even before crossing the threshold, visitors had already been swept into another world. A world where wealth had no ceiling, where imagination sculpted marble, and where architecture was used not just to shelter life, but to declare it. Linden Towers was never meant to blend in. It was meant to rise, to impress, to endure. And for decades it did. Its walls didn't just hold up a roof. They held up a vision of what unchecked ambition, unlimited resources and theatrical genius could create when fused together in one impossible house. Crossing through the iron gates of Linden Towers was not a simple act of entry. It was the beginning of a carefully staged procession. Every inch of the approach to the mansion had been choreographed to build anticipation, to heighten the sense of scale, and to subtly prepare the visitor for the spectacle that waited at the door. This was not an accident, it was design as theater. The gatekeeper's lodge stood just beyond the threshold, a quaint structure in comparison to what lay ahead, but symbolic in its own right. It was the first signal that this estate was not like others, that it required a guardian. As the carriage creaked past, the path began to curve, not in haste, but in deliberate slowness. A straight road would have delivered guests too quickly, spoiled the reveal. Instead, the gravel drive twisted and wound, forcing every visitor to engage with the land. Gardens unfolded like wings on either side of the path, bursting with seasonal flowers and manicured hedges that seemed to have been combed into place. Wide lawns stretched toward the horizon, where the silhouettes of sculpted fountains glistened under the California sun. The air held the scent of roses, citrus trees, and cut grass, each breath hinting at the deliberate care behind the estate's presentation. And through it all, gardeners moved silently, pruning, sweeping, invisible stagehands maintaining the illusion. To the right, past a row of elms, a cluster of grazing cows appeared, not wild but positioned, their presence suggesting rustic harmony rather than rural inconvenience. This was the curated pastoral, a vision of estate life borrowed from the aristocratic traditions of Europe, where even livestock had a role in the composition. Then came the first statues, pairs of stone sphinxes resting on pedestals beside the road. Their weathered faces stared into the middle distance, their bodies poised in frozen motion. They marked a threshold, not physical, but psychological. Visitors were no longer merely guests. They had become part of a performance. With each turn of the path, the facade of the mansion began to peek through the greenery, never fully revealed, just enough to quicken the pulse. By the time the main drive rounded its final curve, the full breadth of Linden Towers burst into view. The fountain at the center of the roundabout danced with water and light, a moving sculpture that reflected the grandeur of the building behind it. The sound of water mingled with the distant calls of birds and the soft rhythm of hooves on gravel. This was the overture before the opera. The carriage came to a gentle stop before the towering front portico. The gravel beneath wheels gave one last satisfying crunch, and the journey transformed. No longer just a drive through property, it had become a passage through time, taste, and the architecture of excess. Everything that came before, the gates, the gardens, the cattle, the statues, served a single purpose: to slow the visitor down, to stretch each second into something memorable. To ensure that by the time they stood at the foot of Linden Towers, looking up at its massive limestone walls and glittering windows, they were no longer in Menlo Park at all. They were somewhere else entirely, somewhere constructed not just of stone and wealth, but of anticipation. As the enormous front doors of Linden Towers swung open, the illusion that had been building from the gate to the portico finally revealed its full intent. Visitors were no longer on a California estate. They were inside a dream shaped from stone, glass, and imagination. The entry hall alone shattered any remaining expectations of domesticity. Here, ceilings soared nearly 20 feet high, crowned in ornate gilding that caught the light from gold-plated chandeliers. The floor beneath your feet was a marble mosaic, cool to the touch and echoing with every step, as if even your footsteps were being invited to perform. Directly ahead, the main corridor stretched out like a royal promenade, running the full width of the home. It was 100 feet of uninterrupted spectacle, flanked by towering doors, decorative columns, and polished surfaces that reflected your silhouette as you moved. Light poured in from hidden skylights, bouncing across the marble floor, and gilded crown moldings, giving the impression that the entire hall glowed from within. The atmosphere was reverent, theatrical, almost intimidating. This was not a place that asked to be lived in. It asked to be admired. To the right, the air changed subtly. The faint scent of leather, aged, oiled, and warm, beckoned from behind thick wooden doors. The library was a sanctuary of dark tones and sensory richness. Its walls were upholstered in hand-tooled leather, every panel embossed with intricate patterns that caught the candlelight. Ebony beams crisscrossed overhead, polished so finely they shimmered like obsidian. Between them, delicate gold leaf was pressed into geometric motifs, creating a celestial ceiling that felt more sacred than scholarly. Lined with leather-bound volumes and antique globes, this was not a space for quiet reading. It was a cathedral for intellect and legacy. Beyond the library, a more playful presence waited. The music room, though smaller, dazzled in its own right. A grand piano stood at the center, so flawlessly polished it mirrored the garden beyond its windows. The acoustics had been tuned to perfection. Every note played here rang with clarity, filling the high-ceiling space with warmth and resonance. Plush settees lined the walls, while heavy velvet drapes softened the light and sound. Golden sconces glimmered like stars, and the polished parquet floor reflected everything like a still pond. Music wasn't just heard in this room, it was performed for the room itself. Opposite the music salon, across the central hall, the drawing room offered yet another personality. Its walls were dressed in imported silks, hand-stenciled with floral flourishes and architectural motifs. But it was the ceiling that demanded attention. An ecclesiastical mural soared above, depicting allegorical figures in movement, bordered with intricate plasterwork that spiraled out toward the walls like petals of a divine flower. Below, European chairs, each one unique, were arranged in conversational circles. Every fabric, every carved leg, every tassel seemed chosen not for comfort, but for visual harmony, as if the furniture were part of a living painting. Moving through these rooms felt less like exploring a house and more like walking through an exhibit. The craftsmanship was obsessive, the materials uncompromising, and the intent unmistakable. Each space was designed to provoke awe, to convey power, to leave an imprint. It wasn't about relaxation or intimacy, it was about legacy. Linden Towers was a physical assertion that James Flood had arrived, and that no visitor would ever forget it. The house did not welcome you, it dared you to keep looking. Continuing deeper into Linden Towers, the architecture ceased to be merely grand. It became theatrical. Every space revealed new layers of excess, each one more immersive than the last. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the grand entertaining rooms, where even the ceilings seemed alive, gazing down upon guests with painted eyes, gilded wings, and silent judgment. These were not rooms made to serve a function. They were environments designed to overwhelm the senses and elevate the ordinary into ceremony. The guest hall, located near the heart of the mansion, was vast and solemn, framed by towering pilasters and crystal wall sconces that bathed the space in a soft, diffuse glow. Velvet-lined chairs and gilded mirrors dotted the periphery, but the ceiling stole the performance. It was a vaulted panorama of mythological scenes, meticulously rendered in fresco. Gods and mortals drifted among clouds, their robes caught in imaginary winds. Borders of intricate plaster filigree wrapped around them, so detailed they cast tiny shadows under candlelight. For any guest standing below, the effect was disorienting. It felt as though the heavens had been peeled open just above your head. Further along the central axis of the home lay the formal dining room, an immense chamber where spectacle reigned. The fireplace alone could have held a dinner party inside it. Above the mantel, two sculpted dragons curled toward one another, their claws clutching the ends of a gilded banner, while their faces stared outward, eternal guardians of the feast. Gilded paneling wrapped the walls in warmth, while tall arched windows filtered in soft morning light, bouncing off polished surfaces and hand-carved sideboards. But again, it was the ceiling that defied belief. An elaborate mural of cherubs and angels, suspended mid-flight, their limbs outstretched as if reaching for the chandeliers. Painted clouds billowed in illusionistic layers, giving the impression that the entire ceiling had opened into the sky. Meals here were never simple acts of nourishment. They were rituals, the clink of crystal, the hush of satin gowns against carved chairs, the quiet astonishment at what surrounded them. Every dinner, no matter how ordinary, became a pageant beneath the gaze of painted wings. For less formal occasions, the Floods could retreat to a breakfast room hidden in the service wing, a space more intimate in size, but no less considered in design. Though no photographs of this room survive, descriptions hint at morning light pouring through mullioned windows, casting angular shadows on delicate wallpaper and polished wood. This was where coffee would steam, fruit would glisten, and the world outside would momentarily disappear behind layers of crafted serenity. Throughout Linden Towers, the ceilings were never forgotten, never flat, never plain. They were canvases, monuments, expressions of ambition pointed upward. In a house where everything had to astonish, even the overhead space became a stage. Guests didn't just walk through rooms. They were constantly looked upon from above, by angels, by dragons, by imagined figures frozen in plaster and paint. The ceilings were the final touch, the most poetic layer of artifice. They reminded every guest, with subtle grandeur, that in this house even the sky was man-made. Away from the public spectacle of Linden Towers, beyond the marble halls and painted ceilings, lay the private quarters, spaces where theatrical grandeur gave way to something more personal, though no less opulent. These rooms were never intended for public admiration, yet they carried just as much meaning. Here, the ambition of the house took on a quieter tone. It was no longer about impressing guests. It was about surrounding oneself with beauty so meticulously curated that even rest became an extension of identity. James Flood's bedroom stood as a reflection of the man himself, eclectic, layered, and unbound by convention. The room was large, with ceilings nearly as high as those in the public areas, but the mood was different, warmer, heavier, more tactile. Furniture pieces from different centuries stood together like old allies, an Eastlake armchair next to a Baroque armoire, a carved writing desk from the Low Countries, and a bed that looked as though it had once belonged to a European duke. The upholstery was rich in color, deep burgundies, dark greens, accented with gold braid, and the drapery was thick enough to silence the world outside. Nothing in the room was casual. Every object, every corner, was chosen to reflect taste, history, and a certain quiet authority. The walls may have been papered or possibly paneled with wood, though surviving descriptions lean toward a fusion of textures, polished surfaces, woven tapestries, and decorative moldings. A large fireplace dominated the far wall, above which hung either a portrait or perhaps a mirror framed in dark walnut. There was no chaos here. The visual weight of the room was deliberate, grounding, as if even in his most private hours, Flood needed to feel anchored in his achievements. Across the hall, Mary Flood's bedroom offered a gentler, more unified sensibility. Unlike her husband's layered mix of styles, Mary's space followed a cohesive vision, where everything seemed to belong to the same imagined story. Pastel tones washed the walls, likely with a lively frieze dancing just below the ceiling, a band of floral or mythological motifs that added rhythm to the room. The furniture matched in tone and shape, perhaps a full set imported from Paris or Vienna, a canopy bed draped in hand-sewn fabrics, a mirrored vanity flanked by crystal perfume bottles, and an armchair positioned perfectly beside the window to catch the morning sun. Curtains were no mere decoration. They were custom sewn, weighted, and stitched from imported textiles. The linens on the bed were hand-embroidered. The carpet may have been woven in Persia or France. There was a sense of softness here, of layered privacy, a sanctuary. But luxury never left the room. It simply changed temperature. Each of the secondary bedrooms in the house followed suit, echoing these two master spaces with their own variations in mood and material. Though no two were exactly alike, a pattern emerged. Writing desks placed with precision in the center of the room, canopies over every bed, coordinated textiles from wall to window to floor. Even in solitude, the house refused to let go of its identity. In these private spaces, Linden Towers revealed its final trick. Beyond the facade, beyond the public show, it could still offer something deeply human, a place to retreat, to rest, to dream, not simply in comfort, but in the belief that even sleep could be worthy of art. Despite the scale, the splendor, and the obsessive attention to detail poured into every square foot of Linden Towers, the truth is that James and Mary Flood barely lived there. The towering estate, with its gardens, fountains, murals, and marble halls, was visited, admired, and hosted, but rarely inhabited. It was, by all appearances, a palace built for people who had no intention of staying. And that fact reveals more about the house's purpose than any architectural blueprint ever could. At the time of its completion, Linden Towers was the largest private residence west of the Rocky Mountains. It surpassed expectations, outshone neighbors, and cast a long shadow over the emerging culture of Gilded Age California. Yet its role in the Flood family's life was curiously peripheral. While the house had been constructed with no expense spared, its rooms filled with imported furniture, its walls with European art, the Floods chose to live in their smaller, though still lavish mansion on Nob Hill in San Francisco. Linden Towers became something else entirely, a stage, a symbol, a statement carved into the soil of Menlo Park. Why build a house only to leave it behind? The answer lies in the psychology of the Gilded Age elite. For men like James Flood, wealth was not just about comfort, it was about narrative. The more extraordinary the house, the more permanent the myth. Linden Towers wasn't constructed to solve a practical need for shelter. It was designed to immortalize a moment in time, a period when fortunes were being made at lightning speed, and architecture was one of the few ways to make that fortune tangible. And so, the mansion became a kind of architectural theater. It was where grand parties could be held, where visiting dignitaries could be impressed, where the landscape itself bowed to the grandeur of human ambition. It was a house to be talked about, not lived in, a place where photographs would be taken, where carriages would line the front court, and where music and laughter would rise through gold-domed ceilings for a night, and then vanish with the last guest. Inside, everything was preserved as if waiting for occupants who never quite arrived. The beds were made, the chandeliers polished, the library shelves filled with volumes no one would ever open. Even the breakfast room, meant to host the most casual, familial moments, remained more of an idea than a setting for daily ritual. The house stood ready, always, like a stage before the curtain call. But the play, more often than not, was never performed. This sense of absence became part of Linden Towers' strange allure. It was a house defined as much by who wasn't in it as by what it contained. Its silence wasn't the result of neglect, but of purpose. It existed as a monument to wealth, not a container for life. And as the years passed, that emptiness only deepened, turning the mansion into something between reality and myth, a shell filled with echoes of a family that chose to live their lives elsewhere, leaving behind only the image of their presence. In the end, Linden Towers was never truly a home. It was an icon, a white castle standing among the oaks, built not to be lived in, but to be remembered. When James Flood's chapter came to a close in 1889, his empire of silver, stocks, and stone passed into new hands. Among his most impressive legacies was Linden Towers, the palace that had once stood as the crown jewel of his ambition. But for his daughter, Jenny, this magnificent structure did not carry the same meaning. Where James had seen permanence, victory, and vision, Jenny saw burden. Almost immediately, the fate of the estate began to shift, not through disaster or decay, but through quiet rejection. Jenny inherited not only the mansion, but its expectations. To live in Linden Towers meant embracing a lifestyle rooted in spectacle, maintenance, and ceremonial duty. It meant caring for a building that was more temple than home, more museum than living space. But Jenny, raised in an entirely different moment, with different values and sensibilities, had no interest in continuing the performance. The house her father built was a monument to his rise, a visual autobiography of a man who never forgot where he came from. But, for Jenny, it was never hers. It had always belonged to someone else's story. Instead of moving in or attempting to breathe new life into the estate, Jenny made a surprising choice. She gave Linden Towers away. Her decision to donate the property to the University of California was as symbolic as it was pragmatic. It was a gesture of respect toward her father's legacy, but also a clear signal that she would not carry it forward. She released the mansion from the family's grasp, perhaps hoping that an institution might find purpose where she could not. But even the university, enticed no doubt by the grandeur of the gift, soon discovered the complications of ownership. The mansion, with all its towers, murals, and endless upkeep, was a financial and logistical weight. What was meant to impress now simply demanded resources. After a brief and uncertain stewardship, the university resold the property, ironically, back into the Flood family. Jenny's brother, James Jr., reclaimed it, perhaps out of sentiment, perhaps as a final effort to preserve what had become an unwanted heirloom. This exchange, gifted, rejected, resold, reveals a deeper truth about Linden Towers. It was no longer just a house. It had become a generational rift made physical, a structure frozen in one man's vision, struggling to find relevance in a new century. The wealth and ambition that had created it belonged to a moment of explosive possibility when fortunes were born in the dirt of Nevada and expressed through limestone and gold. But the next generation did not share that hunger. They did not need to prove themselves in stone. They had already inherited the myth. Linden Towers, once a dream made real, now stood awkwardly between legacy and liability. No longer rooted in utility and increasingly detached from emotional connection, it began its slow drift into obsolescence. A house built to endure was now being quietly passed along, unwanted and out of place in a world that had moved on. The story of its future would no longer be shaped by family or fantasy, but by practicality, disinterest, and the creeping realization that even the grandest visions, if left uninhabited, begin to fade. When the University of California quietly relinquished its hold on Linden Towers, it became clear that grandeur alone could not secure a building's future. The estate, with all its gilded ceilings and marble floors, had proven too large, too ornate, too impractical for academic use. It was a gift that couldn't be unwrapped, a legacy too massive to repurpose. So, it passed once again, not into obscurity, but into the family line, returning to James Flood, Jr., the son of the man who had built it. At first glance, this transfer might have seemed like a turning point. Perhaps the son would restore the house's relevance, breathe new life into its cavernous halls, and reclaim its place in the family story. But, from the beginning, something felt different. Flood Jr. was not the architect of empire his father had been. He had inherited wealth, not earned it. And though he understood the importance of legacy, he lived in a time when the rules of prestige were already shifting. Owning Linden Towers in the early 20th century was no longer a triumph, it was a responsibility. The mansion, with its 6 levels, dozens of rooms, and sprawling gardens, demanded a small army to maintain. Taxes mounted, repairs loomed, and styles changed. What had once been a beacon of status was now considered an eccentric relic of the past. Menlo Park was evolving. The quiet countryside that once embraced the estate was turning into a suburban landscape with new codes, new needs, and less patience for ornamental excess. Flood Jr. did not live there full time. Like his sister before him, he saw the house more as a relic than a residence. It remained in the family, technically, but emotionally it continued to drift. Visitors became fewer. Events grew rarer. The rooms stayed clean, but empty. The music rooms silent. The chandeliers polished but unlit. It was a house preserved in form, but hollow in function. There was no scandal, no catastrophe, no dramatic decline, just inertia. Slowly, quietly, the building began to age, not from use, but from absence. The gardens were harder to justify, the staff harder to maintain. The very things that once made the house so remarkable now made it unsustainable. Linden Towers was a mansion built for a different world, and no matter how much money or sentiment James Jr. brought to it, he couldn't force the past to remain present. By the time of his passing in 1926, the fate of the house was clear, even if no one had spoken it aloud. It would not be saved by nostalgia, nor protected by inheritance. It had returned to the family only to confirm what everyone already suspected, that the era of Linden Towers had quietly come to an end. And soon, the land beneath it would begin to whisper to developers, not dreamers. The house that once stood above the oaks would soon be pulled back down to earth. By 1934, Linden Towers stood like a monument caught between worlds, too old-fashioned to be fashionable, too large to be livable, and far too expensive to maintain. Its halls, once filled with light and laughter, had long since gone quiet. The curtains remained drawn, the chandeliers unlit, the murals fading in the stillness. What had once been the most magnificent private residence in California had now become an oversized burden. The dream that James Flood had carved into limestone was unraveling, not with fire or ruin, but with silence, neglect, and the cold precision of an auctioneer's gavel. It began with the furniture. An estate sale was announced, and soon the house was open to the public, not for admiration, but for inventory. Collectors, opportunists, and the merely curious walked the same marble floors that once echoed under the footsteps of California's elite. They entered not to marvel, but to measure. Cabinets were inspected, mirrors tilted. Silk tapestries touched with gloved fingers. Items that had once been chosen with exacting care, imported from Europe, commissioned from the finest artisans, were now reduced to price tags and catalog numbers. The rooms were emptied in fragments. A chandelier here, a hand-carved sideboard there, the grand piano, the oil paintings, the custom tapestries, all parceled off and sold, not as a collection, but as individual curiosities. The library's volumes scattered into private hands. The drawing room's chairs rehomed in unfamiliar parlors. Even the fireplace mantels, some with dragons carved in gilded wood, were pried from the walls and sold like theatrical props. It was not just a liquidation of property. It was a quiet dismantling of a vision. Each sale was a sentence in a silent farewell. Not just to the house itself, but to the entire era it represented. The Gilded Age, with its spectacular excess, its belief in eternal monuments, its obsession with visual grandeur, had long since passed. The 1930s were shaped by a different mood, financial caution, economic hardship, and a growing discomfort with displays of privilege. There was no appetite to preserve a mansion built to celebrate opulence. Instead, it was easier to forget. No historical society stepped in. No wealthy benefactor rushed to save it. There were no newspaper campaigns, no preservationist pleas. The house had lived its life as a symbol of personal triumph, not public heritage. And so, when the auctions concluded, what remained was a skeleton. Walls that had once embraced a dream, now hollowed out and stripped of meaning. Why didn't anyone save it? Perhaps because no one believed they were losing history. To them, it was just an eccentric relic, oversized and outdated, disconnected from modern needs. The idea of legacy had changed, no longer measured in stone and silver, but in mobility, innovation, and adaptability. Linden Towers, immobile and immense, could not evolve. And in a rapidly changing world, what cannot evolve is quietly erased. The auction was not just the end of a house, it was the final applause for a performance long concluded. A curtain closing not with drama, but with the sound of packing crates and the turning of keys. What followed next was inevitable. The estate, stripped of identity, would soon face its final fate, not as a ruin, but as raw land waiting for someone else's dream. Linden Towers did not crumble slowly, nor was it lovingly deconstructed brick by brick. It was blown apart, quickly, deliberately, and without ceremony. After the final auction, after the last chairs had been loaded onto trucks and the chandeliers boxed in straw, the house stood briefly as a hollow husk. Its once glittering interiors now echoed with dust and wind, its windows dark, its doors chained shut. And then came the decision that would seal its fate forever: demolition by implosion. By the mid-1930s, the cost of tearing down such an enormous structure was prohibitive. The mansion had been built to last, its stone walls thick, its foundation deep, its materials stubbornly resistant to decay. To dismantle it would have required months of labor and enormous expense. But California, like much of the country during the Depression era, had little patience or budget for nostalgia. The developers who acquired the land saw not a monument, but an obstacle. And so, they did what was practical. They brought in explosives. The detonation was swift. Stone cracked, marble splintered. Sculptures collapsed in seconds. Domes that once caught the sunlight folded inward like paper under fire. Linden Towers, the largest and most extravagant home west of the Rockies, was reduced to rubble in a single violent moment. Its legacy shattered, its silhouette wiped from the sky. But what happened next was perhaps even more surreal. Rather than clearing the site, rather than hauling away tons of debris to be recycled or buried elsewhere, the remains were simply pushed into the earth. The walls, the floors, the arches, the staircases, they weren't taken away. They were entombed. Bulldozers flattened the ruins, leveling the jagged skeleton into a kind of underground grave. Fill dirt was poured over it, smoothing the land for future development. The marble mosaic floors now lay beneath 10 feet of silence. Statues and cornices, cracked and incomplete, were buried where they fell. Above this strange, invisible mausoleum, a new landscape was planned. Suburban streets were drawn across the former gardens. Sidewalks would one day stretch where carriages once rolled. Homes would rise where fountains once danced. The land was renamed, repurposed, and redeveloped. Lindenwood, a tidy housing development for a new generation, built quite literally on top of the ruins of the past. Few of the new residents would ever know what lay beneath their feet. There were no plaques, no guided tours, no reminders, just ordinary yards and driveways, carefully laid over the bones of a fantasy. And so, the dream of James Flood, the palace built not for living, but for legacy, was buried under its own weight, not preserved in a museum or carved into the collective memory of the state, but compressed into the soil of Menlo Park, lost beneath the most mundane markers of modern life. Beneath lawns and garages, beneath swing sets and satellite dishes, fragments of limestone and gold leaf still sleep. It was not a fire, or war, or time that claimed the house. It was indifference. It was progress. And it was the quiet, brutal efficiency of a world that no longer had room for dreams that dared to be that large. In the years following the implosion of Linden Towers, the land that had once held the weight of California's most elaborate mansion was quietly divided, parceled, and sold. The gardens were flattened, the fountains disappeared, the winding gravel drive that once welcomed carriages now led nowhere. What rose in its place wasn't a new palace, nor a cultural monument, but something far more ordinary. A suburban neighborhood. Lindenwood. The name, a soft echo of what had been, was likely chosen for its pleasant tone, evoking trees, calm, and a touch of history without revealing too much. There were no plaques to mark what had been buried, no monuments to the marble halls that now lay in silence. Instead, there were cul-de-sacs and sidewalks, picket fences and lawn sprinklers. Families moved in, planted rose bushes, and built lives in split-level homes. They were drawn by good schools, quiet streets, and the promise of a stable, peaceful life. And unknowingly, they moved into a place still haunted by architecture. Beneath their foundations, beneath basements and garages, fragments of Linden Towers remain. In the lowest contours of the land, places developers used to even out the terrain, lie shattered marble floors, carved stone mantels, rusted wrought iron, and splintered columns. Somewhere beneath a backyard swing set, maybe a piece of a dragon that once adorned the fireplace. Beneath the dining room of a ranch-style home, there may be tiles that once reflected gold chandeliers. The streets themselves, laid over compacted history, trace paths that once belonged to formal gardens and grazing pastures. Most residents have never heard of James Flood, never imagined that the ground they walk on daily holds layers of gilded plaster, hand-painted murals, and limestone that once shimmered in the sunlight. They mow lawns where angels once looked down from the ceilings. They walk dogs over a land that once required liveried gatekeepers. They host barbecues above a palace that has been buried, not metaphorically, but literally. Every so often, a homeowner digging deep for a new tree root or foundation line might uncover something strange. A smooth stone too finely cut to be natural, a glint of ceramic glaze, a piece of decorative molding with a pattern that doesn't belong to any modern design. They might dismiss it, never realizing they've held a fragment of a forgotten empire in their hands. Lindenwood is peaceful now, a place of order, familiarity, and routine. But it sits atop something that defies all those things. It sits atop ambition, illusion, and the physical remnants of one man's determination to be remembered forever. What's remarkable is not that the house was destroyed, but that it was not truly erased. It was buried whole, like a sleeping giant. Its bones spread quietly under the rhythms of suburban life. The empire is gone, but its foundation remains, hidden in plain sight. And perhaps, in some strange way, that's the most enduring legacy Linden Towers could have asked for. To remain not in memory, but in matter, beneath the feet of a world that no longer knows its name. Today, if you drive along Middlefield Road in Menlo Park, you may notice a long stretch of red brick wall running parallel to traffic. It doesn't call much attention to itself, just an old barrier, weathered by decades, seemingly forgotten by the modern world rushing past. But if you look closer, near the southern end, you'll find a set of iron gates, massive, ornate, and stubbornly intact. They stand like the teeth of a great beast, long buried. Behind them, a small lodge sits quietly, a gatekeeper's house that hasn't welcomed a guest in nearly a century. These are the final fragments of Linden Towers, the last sentinels of an empire turned invisible. Everything else is gone. The dome, the murals, the chandeliers, the sphinxes. The long drive once flanked by grazing cattle is now a paved street with numbered houses. The gardens have been replaced by patios. The angels painted on ceilings now sleep beneath swing sets and garden sheds. And yet, those gates remain, rusted but defiant. They have seen the world change around them and still hold their ground, offering a mute testimony to what once stood just beyond their reach. Their survival is more than coincidence. They remind us that architecture, at its most extreme, is never just about walls or roofs. It's about intention. Linden Towers was never a house in the traditional sense. It was a sculpture of ambition, an altar to wealth, and a mirror reflecting the American dream in its most theatrical form. Built by a man who rose from poverty to unthinkable wealth, it was a statement that anything was possible, that permanence could be purchased, and that legacy could be carved in limestone. But that dream proved fragile. The mansion lasted less than 60 years. Its materials were strong, but its relevance was not. It became too large, too costly, too symbolic of a time that no longer made sense. In the end, it wasn't lost to war, disaster, or fire. It was lost to disinterest, to practicality, to the quiet erosion of memory. And that is why the story of Linden Towers matters, because it reveals the paradox at the heart of the American dream. The idea that through effort and vision, anyone can rise, and yet even the greatest triumphs can disappear without a sound. It's a cautionary tale, a celebration, and a eulogy all at once. The house was not just demolished, it was buried by the very progress it once embodied. The dream did not collapse, it was overwritten. And yet, behind those gates, in the cracks of the brick wall, the story still lingers. It lingers in the shadows of passing cars, in the rust on wrought iron, in the silence of a lodge that no longer has a purpose. It survives in fragments beneath the ground, and in whispers among those who remember what once stood here. Linden Towers was born from ambition and swallowed by time. But for those who stop, who look past the fences and wonder what once stood in that quiet stretch of Menlo Park, the gates still open. Not physically, but imaginatively. And through them, we glimpse not just a forgotten mansion, but the shape of dreams too large for the world to hold.